You know, it's fascinating when you really think about it, how U.S. manufacturing has changed. I mean, we were the ones. We were the big dogs. The world looked to us for, well, for pretty much everything. And then, well, things shifted, right? Production went overseas, and you can't help but wonder, can we really turn back the clock? Can the U.S. be that manufacturing powerhouse again?
It's a big question, isn't it? And it's one we're going to dive into today.
Exactly. We're going deep, folks. We've been poring over reports, analyses, you name it all, trying to figure out if this whole idea of onshoring, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., if it's even realistic.
It's more than just headlines, right?
Way more. We want to get into the nitty-gritty, understand the complexities, figure out if there really is potential for a manufacturing comeback here, and if so, well, what's it going to take?
We need to look at where U.S. manufacturing stands today.
Yeah.
The numbers, the trends, all of it. Then we got to unpack what caused the shift in the first place.
Right, because those factors are still in play.
They are. And, of course, we can't ignore the challenges. Bringing manufacturing back isn't going to be a walk in the park.
Definitely not. But there's got to be a flip side, right?
Absolutely. There are compelling reasons, real opportunities that make onshoring, well, a pretty exciting prospect.
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks. Right now, today, what's the state of U.S. manufacturing? How much does it contribute to our economy, and how many people are working in the sector?
So even with all the changes, manufacturing still holds its own. In 2023, it contributed, let's see, somewhere between $2.3 and $2.5 trillion to the GDP, depending on who you ask.
Okay, so that's significant.
It is. And if you look at more recent figures, like from the third quarter of 2024, we're talking annualized numbers around $2.93 trillion.
So what, like 10 to 12% of the total U.S. economy?
Right around there, yeah. Which makes you think, if we're serious about boosting that, well, there are other sectors we got to contend with.
That's a good point. What about the jobs picture? How many people are actually working in manufacturing these days?
In 2023, it was around 15.6 million. That's roughly 9.7% of the whole U.S. workforce. But here's something interesting. This is important for our discussion. By February 2025, that number had gone up.
Really?
Yeah, up to about 12.765 million. That's actually more than the pre-pandemic average, between 2017 and 2019. Back then, it was around 12.6 million.
So a bit of a rebound.
You could say that.
Yeah.
But you got to zoom out a little. The long-term trend tells a different story. I mean, manufacturing employment as a percentage of the total workforce, well, that peaked way back during World War II.
Yeah.
Close to 39%.
Wow.
And now it's down to about 8% by the end of 2024. It was around 9.7% in 2023. So even if we see some jobs coming back, the big picture is we're shifting towards a service-based economy. That's something to keep in mind with onshoring.
Absolutely. A lot to consider there. And what's the unemployment rate like in manufacturing right now?
Actually, it's pretty low, just 2.9% as of February 2025. So the labor market in manufacturing is pretty tight.
Makes sense. So if we want to bring a lot of manufacturing back, who's going to do the work?
Exactly. It's a question we need to answer. Workforce development, attracting people to these jobs, those are going to be key. But to understand just how much has changed, think about this. The most manufacturing jobs we ever had in the U.S. was back around 1979. Almost 20 million workers. That's a huge difference from where we are now. And if you look at manufacturing GDP, its biggest slice of the pie was back in the late 90s. It was about 15–16% of the total GDP. Now, like we said, it's down to 10–11%. The bottom line is the relative role of manufacturing in the U.S. economy has definitely shrunk over time.
Okay, so we've got the snapshot of where we are today. But how did we get here? What happened to the U.S. being the manufacturing king of the world? Why did so much production move overseas?
Well, there are a few big forces at play here. Globalization, for one. You can't talk about this without talking about globalization and trade liberalization.
Right, like opening up markets and free trade agreements.
Exactly. I mean, think about NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. It basically wiped out most tariffs on goods traded between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico.
And then there was China joining the World Trade Organization. Right?
Yeah, in 2001.
Yeah.
That was a huge deal. It really brought China into the global trading system. And all of this meant it was a lot easier and cheaper for companies to move manufacturing to countries where labor costs were way lower.
So globalization kind of set the stage?
It did. And technology, too. Advancements in tech made it easier for companies to manage production overseas. And then you've got corporate strategies. A lot of companies were really focused on keeping costs down, maximizing profits in the short term.
And offshoring was the way to do that.
It was. And the effects were pretty dramatic. I mean, between 2002 and 2022, over 45,000 manufacturing firms in the U.S. just disappeared. That's a staggering number.
No kidding. And we lost our top spot, right?
We did. In 2010, China took over as the world's leading manufacturer, and they're now producing trillions of dollars more in manufactured goods every year. And that reliance on overseas production really shows up in our trade deficit, especially when it comes to manufactured goods. It was projected to be over $1.1 trillion in 2021. That's how much more we're importing than exporting.
Wow. I remember those debates about free trade back in the day. It felt like a big economic shift, and I guess it really was.
Oh, it definitely was a big one.
So we talked about those lower labor costs being a big draw for manufacturers. Can you give us a sense of just how much lower those costs actually are?
Sure. As of mid-2024, the average manufacturing worker in the U.S. was making almost $30 an hour. In China, it was more like $7 an hour.
Huge difference.
Huge. And it's even more stark if you look at other countries. Mexico, for example, it was about $4.3 an hour. In Vietnam, about 2.0. And in the early days of China's manufacturing boom, wages were even lower, like 25 cents to $1.25 an hour.
That's wild. I mean, that's a huge incentive to move production.
It is. And it's a big challenge for onshoring.
Definitely. So we've got globalization, we've got labor costs. What else contributed to U.S. manufacturing losing its edge?
Well, technology played a role too. Not just in making it easier to manage production overseas, but also in changing the nature of work itself. Automation, robots and all that, it increased productivity and efficiency like crazy. But it also meant fewer workers were needed.
So even if jobs weren't going overseas, they were being replaced by machines.
Right. It's a double whammy for manufacturing jobs. And here's another interesting wrinkle. The U.S. has actually seen slower productivity growth in manufacturing in recent years, especially in electronics, which used to be a big driver. Makes you wonder if we're falling behind.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So technology is a bit of a double-edged sword. We need it to be competitive, but it can also lead to job losses.
Exactly. It's a tricky balance. And then there's the whole corporate strategy piece. Over the past few decades, a lot of companies have been laser-focused on short-term profits. That often means cutting costs above all else. And offshoring was a big part of that.
Yeah, finding the cheapest way to produce, no matter where it is.
Right. And the thing is, this really impacted investment in U.S. manufacturing. In the 2000s, fixed capital investment actually went down. It was the first time that had happened since they started tracking that data back in the 40s.
Wow. That's a pretty clear signal that companies were choosing to invest elsewhere.
It is. So you put all of that together, global trade, cost pressures, technology, corporate decisions, and it's not surprising that manufacturing shifted the way it did.
Makes sense. So given all that history, all those forces at play, what are the real obstacles to bringing manufacturing back to the U.S.? What are the biggest challenges of onshoring?
Well, those labor costs are still a big one. That gap we talked about is not going away overnight. And then there's the whole regulatory landscape here in the U.S. It can be tough for manufacturers to navigate all the rules at the federal, state, and local levels.
It's not exactly a simple system.
No, it's not. I mean, think about things like the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA. That covers wages and working hours. And then you've got OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, setting standards for workplace safety. The National Association of Manufacturers, NAM, they actually tallied up almost 300,000 federal restrictions. That's a lot to deal with.
Yeah, and then each state has its own rules too, right?
Yep. That adds another layer of complexity for companies operating in multiple states. Now, a lot of these regulations are there for good reason, but they definitely add to the cost of doing business in the U.S.
So it's not just about building a factory, it's about understanding the whole legal and regulatory environment.
Exactly. And then you've got to think about supply chains. For decades, companies have built up these intricate networks for offshore production. Bringing manufacturing back means starting from scratch, finding new suppliers for raw materials, components, logistics, all of it. And that takes time, effort, and a lot of
A
investment,
complete overhaul.
basically. And then there's infrastructure. After years of focusing on overseas production, you have to wonder, is the U.S. equipped to handle a significant increase in manufacturing? Do we have the transportation networks, the energy capacity, everything that's needed? Even recent projects, like that new TSMC semiconductor plant in Arizona, have highlighted potential strains on existing infrastructure. They need a massive amount of electricity to run that facility.
So it's about having the whole ecosystem in place, not just the factory itself.
Right. And then, of course, there's the upfront cost. Building new factories, upgrading old ones, buying new machinery, training workers. It's expensive. And construction costs have been going up. Since 2021, over $500 billion has been spent on new manufacturing facilities. That shows you the kind of investment we're talking about.
That's a lot of money.
It is. And then there's the big one, the skills gap. We're talking about a shortage of skilled workers, the technicians, the engineers, the people who can actually run these advanced manufacturing operations. Projections show we could be short over 2 million manufacturing workers by 2030. That's a major bottleneck for onshoring.
So it's not just about finding people to work, it's about finding people with the right skills.
Exactly. And it's not just about attracting new workers. It's about keeping the experienced ones we have. In some places, the manufacturing workforce is aging, which means we need to make sure that knowledge and expertise gets passed on to the next generation.
It's a long-term challenge.
It is. And then, on top of labor costs, just the day-to-day expenses of running a manufacturing operation can be higher in the U.S.
Well,
Everything. Raw materials, tooling, packaging, shipping, maintenance, insurance, overhead, legal costs. It all adds up. And when you compare it to places like China, where costs have generally been lower across the board, or even to countries like Germany and Japan, where some costs might be higher, but they make up for it in other areas, you see the competitive challenges U.S. manufacturing faces.
It's a tough landscape to navigate.
No doubt about it.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of obstacles, but there's got to be another side to this story. What are the arguments for onshoring? What are the opportunities that are making people take a second look at bringing manufacturing back home?
Well, there are a lot of good reasons, even with all the challenges. And one of the most obvious is jobs. I mean, that's what everyone talks about, right? And then the numbers are pretty encouraging. In 2022, something like 360,000 manufacturing jobs came back to the U.S. That's a 53% jump compared to the year before.
So it's not just talk, it's actually happening.
It is. And the projections for 2023 suggested another 400,000 jobs coming back or being created. Plus, when you factor in investments in advanced manufacturing tech, that's expected to create over 210,000 new jobs by 2030. Some estimates even say we could see up to 1.5 million new manufacturing jobs overall, especially for people with mid-level skills. The Reshoring Initiative, they track all this data, and they estimate that almost 2 million manufacturing jobs have returned to the U.S. since 2010.
Wow, those are real numbers.
They are. And it's not just about the economic impact. There's also the national security angle. When you bring manufacturing back home, you're less reliant on those long, complicated global supply chains. That's especially important for things like medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, things we really need.
Right. We saw how fragile those supply chains can be during the pandemic.
Exactly. We can't afford to be caught off guard like that again. And that's why you see initiatives like the Defense Production Act prioritizing domestic production for critical industries.
It's about resilience.
It is. And onshoring also gives companies more control over their production from start to finish, sourcing raw materials all the way to delivering the final product.
So fewer disruptions, more reliability.
Right. And when you produce things here, you're also boosting domestic demand. More jobs, more profits staying in the U.S. economy. That means people have more money to spend. It's a virtuous cycle.
It all feeds back into itself.
It does. And there's the environmental aspect, too. Shorter supply chains mean less transportation, which means a smaller carbon footprint. And a lot of manufacturers are already working to be more energy efficient.
So it's a win-win.
Potentially, yes.
Yes.
And onshoring can make companies more agile, more responsive to changes in the market. When you're producing closer to your customers, you can adapt more quickly to what they need and want.
Shorter lead times, faster turnaround.
Exactly. And finally, there's innovation. Having a strong domestic manufacturing base can really drive research and development. When you have R&D happening close to where things are being produced, it's easier to take those new ideas and turn them into real products. And the U.S. still leads the world in business R&D spending, so that's a big advantage.
So it's not just about bringing back the old ways of manufacturing. It's about building a more modern, innovative, and resilient system.
That's the idea.
You mentioned technology earlier, how it played a role in the decline of U.S. manufacturing. How can technology now help us bring manufacturing back?
Oh, technology is crucial. I mean, think about automation. Robots are getting more sophisticated all the time, and they can do a lot of the tasks that used to be done by human workers. And that helps offset those higher labor costs we talked about.
So robots could make it more cost-effective to produce things here in the U.S.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Some estimates say that 60% or more of current factory tasks could be automated with the technology we have right now. And companies that have adopted automation are seeing huge productivity gains, like 7% to 50% in some cases. That's a game changer.
Wow. And it's not just about replacing workers, right? There are new types of jobs emerging in this automated world.
Absolutely. You need people who can program robots, maintain them, and analyze all the data they generate. And then you've got collaborative robots, cobots, that work alongside humans. They can handle the dangerous or repetitive tasks, freeing up people to do more skilled work.
It's changing the nature of manufacturing jobs.
It is. And then you've got artificial intelligence, AI, and machine learning. They're becoming more common in manufacturing too, helping with things like real-time data analysis and predictive maintenance, which can prevent equipment breakdowns. And then there are all the digital manufacturing technologies like 3D printing, CAD/CAM, simulation software. They're making it possible to produce more complex and customized products here in the U.S.
It's a whole new world of manufacturing.
It is. And the U.S. is well positioned to be a leader in this high-tech, high-skill manufacturing sector. Initiatives like Manufacturing USA are helping to drive innovation and collaboration in this space.
So it sounds like technology can be a real driver of onshoring. What about the government? What role can the government play in supporting this shift?
The government has a big role to play. I mean, they're already doing a lot to encourage onshoring, using things like financial incentives. There are tax credits for companies that bring manufacturing back to the U.S., subsidies, grants, even direct funding, like the CHIPS Act, for example. That's $52 billion to boost domestic semiconductor manufacturing. And the Inflation Reduction Act has a lot of incentives for clean energy manufacturing here in the U.S.
So making it more financially attractive to produce domestically.
Right. It's about leveling the playing field a bit. And then there are trade policies, like the Buy American Act, which favors U.S.-made goods for government projects. And there's talk about things like offshoring tax penalties, tariffs, import restrictions, all aimed at making it more expensive to produce things overseas.
So a mix of carrots and sticks.
Yeah, pretty much. And the government's also involved in strategic planning. There's the National Strategy for Advanced Manufacturing, which is all about having a national vision for the future of U.S. manufacturing. They want to see things invented here and made here.
A made in America future.
You could say that. And then there's workforce development. The government is putting more emphasis on training programs to make sure we have the skilled workers we need for this new era of manufacturing. And there's also a growing recognition that we need to invest in infrastructure, things like transportation and energy, to support a manufacturing revival. The Biden-Harris administration have a whole plan for revitalizing American manufacturing, and infrastructure is a big part of it.
So it sounds like a multi-pronged approach.
It is. They're trying to address the issue from a lot of different angles.
Okay, so we've talked about the U.S. What about the rest of the world? How do we stack up against other big manufacturing countries?
Well, right now, China's the biggest player. They're producing about 31.6% of all manufactured goods globally, something like $5 trillion worth. They've got those low labor costs, a huge workforce, and their quality is getting better all the time. Just to give you an idea, in 2011, over 21% of China's workforce was in manufacturing.
That's a lot of people making things.
It is. The U.S. is the second largest, with about 15.9% of global output. That's over $2.5 trillion in GDP. We're good at advanced manufacturing techniques, high-quality goods, innovation, but we also have higher costs and more regulations than China.
What about other countries, like Japan, Germany? How do they compare?
Japan's number 3, producing about $1.2 trillion worth of goods in 2023. That's about 6.5% of global output. They're really strong in electronics, cars, computer components, especially semiconductors. They also have stricter labor regulations, more like the U.S. Germany's the 4th largest. They're known for high-quality goods, especially cars and machinery. They're really export-focused, and they have a unique system for labor relations with strong worker representation.
So it's a mixed bag.
It is. When you look at cost competitiveness, the U.S. generally has higher labor costs than China. But we can be competitive in certain sectors like chemicals or food and beverage. It really depends on a lot of factors.
So each country has its own strengths and weaknesses.
That's right.
Okay, so what are the experts saying about the future of U.S. manufacturing? Do they think onshoring can really work?
Well, a lot of experts are actually pretty optimistic. They think we're seeing the beginning of a real manufacturing comeback in the U.S. They point to things like the growing focus on resilient supply chains, government support, and a renewed interest in American-made products.
So it's more than just wishful thinking.
Yeah, I think there's a sense that things are starting to shift. And you even see more companies talking about reshoring in their earnings calls, which means they're thinking about it strategically. Some analysts think manufacturing could boost U.S. GDP by over 15% this decade. And since 2020, investment in manufacturing structures has doubled. A lot of people think that's because of the U.S. and China kind of decoupling economically.
So there's momentum.
There is. But of course, there are still concerns. The experts still point to those challenges we talked about: labor costs, the skills gap, the need for investment. And they say that automation is going to be essential moving forward, that we need to embrace those technologies to stay competitive.
Makes sense. So robots are going to be a big part of this manufacturing renaissance.
Most likely, yes. And the experts also emphasize that government support is crucial. They say we need a clear, long-term national strategy for manufacturing. And while they're optimistic, most agree that we're probably not going back to the days when manufacturing was the dominant force in the U.S. economy. The service sector is just too big now.
So it's about finding our niche.
Right. It's about focusing on strategic sectors, being innovative, using technology to our advantage, and having smart policies in place. And it's important to remember that even with the job losses, U.S. manufacturing output has actually gone up by about 80% since the 80s. That's because of productivity gains and efficiency.
So it's not just about the number of jobs, it's about what we're producing and how we're producing it.
Exactly.
Okay, so given everything we've talked about, what's the most likely scenario for U.S. manufacturing? Can we really become a major force again?
Well, I think the most realistic scenario is one of targeted onshoring. We'll probably see the most growth in sectors that are strategically important and technologically advanced, things like high-tech electronics, medical equipment, advanced materials, precision engineering, clean energy. And we might see more hybrid models, where companies keep some production overseas, but bring the critical stuff back home.
So a more strategic approach, not just trying to bring back everything.
Right, and it's probably going to be a gradual shift, with more and more companies adopting advanced technologies as they see the benefits of domestic production. And it's going to require a lot of collaboration between the government and the private sector, especially when it comes to things like workforce development, infrastructure, research.
It's a team effort.
It is. And we need to be adaptable. The global landscape is always changing, so we can't just try to recreate the past. We have to be forward-thinking.
Adapt and innovate. Well, I think that gives us a really good overview of this whole onshoring issue. It's complicated, there are challenges, but there are also real opportunities. So for our listeners out there, the takeaway is that while we might not see a return to the manufacturing dominance of the past, a significant comeback in key sectors is definitely possible. It's going to take a combination of technology, smart policies, and a commitment to innovation.
It's a fascinating time to be watching this all unfold, and it really makes you think about the future of U.S. manufacturing. What role will it play in our economy, in our national security, in our global standing? It's something we all need to be engaged with and thinking about.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our final thought for you, our listeners. Given all the complexities we've discussed, the economic realities, the strategic needs, what industries do you think hold the most promise for onshoring? And what kind of long-term vision do we need to make it happen? It's a question worth pondering. What will the future of American manufacturing look like? We'd love to hear your thoughts.